Welcome back. After that inspiring presentation, I know, like on our feet. So I'm Patricia. I'm on the WEBA Advisory Committee. It's a huge privilege for me to be standing up in front of you to introduce our next speaker, who is a human that challenges conventions to promote change, and that requires bravery, creativity, and curiosity. And Mandy Ralston manifests all of those character strengths and so many more. Her career pathway as a clinician and a business owner and serial entrepreneur makes her uniquely qualified to help us all evaluate our work and our field, and helps us increase our capacity to operate in shades of gray. So please join me in welcoming a change maker, Mandy Ralston.
Please welcome to the stage Mandy Ralston, who will be presenting #IsNotBinary, avoiding black and white attitudes in practice and life.
Are we on? Is this working? There it is. I always knew the voice of God would be a woman. All right. All right. So, I'm Mandy Ralston. I'm the founder and CEO of Non-Binary Solutions. I have built 2 different clinics in Kentucky. The first one, me and 3 other women, started in 1999. We grew that to 125 clients and 85 employees in less than 3 years. For the price of a Harvard MBA, I got a real-life business degree in making mistakes the first time making that clinic, right? And then I incorporated verbal behavior consulting in 2007 and sold that in 2019 to Blue Sprig, right? There they are. So I've spent some time in the organization there, and then I started Non-Binary Solutions in 2022. So it's about 2 years old at this point. So we were making clinical decision support technology, so sort of like a co-pilot, if you will, for providers to use to build out treatment pathways. So, let's see. All right. I want to tell you a story about building this company, though. So, unlike building the clinics, where I was using the profits to organically grow that organization over time, with a startup, a tech startup, you have to go out and raise funding first, right? So part of what I have to do is go out and pitch to venture capital people to try to raise funds to actually build the product in the first place. And it's interesting because the individuals that I'm pitching to are a pretty homogeneous group of people. They tend to be older, white males, right? And so I get a lot of questions about, why did you name your company Non-Binary Solutions? What does that mean? Is that something sexual, right? Maybe you should think about changing the name of your company. I get a lot of unsolicited advice, right? Right? So, yeah, there's a few different reasons that I named the company Non-Binary Solutions, but we'll come back to that. So first, let's try to define some things about non-binary and what I mean by that. Non-binary thinking is, by definition, the position or the idea that there are only 2 sides to some issue, and you have to pick one, right? So it's dichotomous thinking. This way of thinking makes it easier for us to move through the world. The problem with non-binary thinking, though, is that by making things black and white, or ones and zeros only, you miss the gray area in between about the issues that you're thinking about, right? And I think this is a very important concept to think about clinically, because when you categorize people or you move through the world thinking in binaries, then you miss the humanity of the person standing in front of you, right? They are not just black and white. They are not just ones and zeros. They are not just autistic or neurotypical, right? It's not binary. I'm going to get you guys to say this with me at some point. Come on. Okay. So why do we do it? Well, we're taught to do it early on in childhood, right? But what's bigger about binary thinking is it gives us a sense of certainty, right? It alleviates anxiety. When we're faced with a choice of some sort, we want to be right or wrong, right? We want to be on the right side of history. We want to say, okay, I've moved through that decision point quickly, and now I can get on to the next thing. And with the level of uncertainty in the world that we're dealing with right now, it's no wonder that we try to think in binaries, right? Everything is very anxiety-driven, especially on social media, right? If you're familiar with the paradox of choice, that's sort of the other end of the decision-making spectrum, right? How many of you guys have gone into the grocery store and gone to the yogurt aisle? There's a yogurt aisle. That's how many choices you have of yogurt, right? So that's sort of the opposite end. So that's the paradox of choice. Then you're frozen. You can't make a decision because you're faced with so many different decision points that you just sort of give up. So the opposite of that is the binary thinking, where we try to make something black and white. We try to make it a yes or a no and immediately move through that decision point. And we make about 35,000 decisions per day, right? So it's no wonder that we have decision fatigue, and we want to make these things easier on ourselves. With everything being so complex, and especially on social media, I think it's, again, very sticky, very catchy to try to either like or unlike something, right? To immediately say, I agree or I disagree with that thing so that you, again, alleviate that sense of anxiety of, do I really understand what this person's talking about, right? So I think it's important to think about this in terms of social media as well as our practice, because you can't know everything about everything. Nobody does, right? So let's talk about a list of binaries. Here's a whole bunch of them. Good, bad, male, female, man, woman, black, white, Republican or Democrat, citizen, foreigner, autistic, neurotypical, pro-life or pro-choice, cat, dog, gay, straight, reinforcement, punishment, APBA versus CalABA. That was a thing 2 years ago when I first did this talk, because it was on the same weekend and people were just panicking on social media. Like, what do I do? Oh my God, do I have to choose APBA or CalABA? I'm like, calm down. We've got Behavior Live now. You can do both, right? Fat versus thin, day versus night, addict versus sober, DC versus Marvel. My nephew put this question to me. He's like, are you a DC or a Marvel kind of person? I was like, I don't know. I like Deadpool. What's that? Right? Professional or unprofessional? How many of you guys have been questioned about what you wear? Woo, oh, there they are. Hi. Your tattoos, your piercings, your hair, your earrings, right? I got a whole other talk to give you some other day about professionalism is a Trojan horse for all kinds of othering, right? Yeah, don't get me started. Rich versus poor, success versus failure, healthy or unhealthy, east, west, poly, mono, open, closed, all these binaries. How do they make you feel? Maybe a sense of anxiety, maybe a sense of superiority or inferiority, right? So most of us are not one or the other of any of these things. We're a mix of all of these things, right? Hashtag it's not binary. The first time I did this talk in APBA in Seattle, I went outside the hotel and I saw this picture, and my brain immediately tried to make it into a binary. I was like, is that a manned or attacked? Why not both, right? So binaries create categorical thinking, and categories move us towards certainty, but away from clarity. Another way to say this is Mark Twain's quote, which is, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so, right? So it's not what you don't know that causes the problem. It's what data you've been relying on that is not correct that'll get you into trouble, right? So categories move us away from certainty. Again, why do we do this? This is rooted in childhood. We teach simple discriminations right off the bat to kids, right? Cat versus dog. And then kids overgeneralize that thing that they learned the first time, and so everything becomes a cat, right? Because they're using a binary. If it's soft, if it's fluffy, and it has a tail, it's a cat, right? And then we also teach this in school, right? We do true or false. There's only one right answer. Multiple choice, there's only one right answer. Even in ABA and early intervention programs, we teach these categories, right? We do RFFCs. We sort things into categories for the kids. So it does come in handy, but the problem is when we overgeneralize those things. And one of the biggest questions I've learned to ask when faced with binaries in politics, on social media, in conversations, is cui bono, which is Latin for who benefits? Who is benefiting from making this a binary decision? It's making me believe that I have to pick one side or the other. Making me believe that this is not nuanced, that there isn't greater context to consider here. Who is benefiting from that? I think what we're seeing in politics and media in general is a great use of this dichotomous thinking, this false dichotomy that you have to pick some side, right? I have used these techniques, obviously, also within ABA. We use forced choices, right? Rather than telling a child to say, come over here and sit down with me, we say, which chair do you want to sit in, red or blue, right? Because that, again, puts a point on it and says, well, now you have control. You get to choose, right? But I've made it a binary for them. Look what's happened with our society with the adoption of the internet and social media, right? We've got a lot of manufactured outrage. This is a tool that media and politicians use to garner support for their causes, right? It's the idea that they have some kind of moral high ground that they're standing on, and that if you don't get on board with that manufactured outrage, you're wrong, right? So be aware of it. Who's benefiting from this? Who's benefiting from making you feel this way? I love this quote from Tyra when she was at the ethics position at the BACB. She was rolling out some new information, some new guidance around the use of our credentials in social media, and she said, just don't be a bully, right? You don't have to weaponize the ethics code against each other. If you see somebody making this mistake, thank you, yes, right? Don't be a bully. And so I think about this, standing up here on stage, it's the number one fear of people in general is to do public speaking. I don't have the same degree, obviously. I get up here and I run my mouth a lot. But I definitely was worried about having this discussion, doing this presentation. How many of you guys have been worried about saying something online or in a conversation for fear of being wrong, right? Or you might get canceled, or you might get shamed, right? Somebody's going to call you out on social media. We just did a panel about this yesterday, right? This is my point. You can't know everything about everything, right? And the person behaving next to you also can't know everything about everything. They don't have your same context. They don't have your same data set, right? So when they make mistakes, give them grace. This is why it's so important to behave with humility, not just in our practice, but in our daily lives, and especially on social media. Behaving, right? The bigger point to this whole conversation is that as a behavior analyst or in this field, if you think whatever you are doing today is going to be relevant, ethical, or appropriate in 10 years, maybe even 5, you're in for a rough look back on your life, right? The things that we are doing today are not going to be relevant, appropriate, ethical. We're going to look like dinosaurs at some point in the future. So again, you've got to behave with humility. You have to say, we're doing the best we can with the information that we have right now. Our understanding of autism and neurodiversity is going to continue to change, right? I'll try to read a little something for you here, and I just realized I'm not going to be able to read the whole thing because these notes are going to be truncated, but I'll do my best here. If somebody would get a picture with me with this building, this is my hometown. This is the Weston State Hospital in Weston, West Virginia. Fun fact, this is the second largest hand-cut stone building in the world. The first is the Taj Mahal, right? But here's the thing about this building. I grew up blocks away from this thing. This is a place where unspeakable things happened in the name of psychology and psychiatry, okay? So the institution planted a seed of curiosity about the field of psychology for me, and today the empty architectural relic remains a constant reminder of cultural and professional humility. Now, I don't claim that I've gotten any of these sentiments consistently correct, but as a recovering Christian, I extrapolate the ideas always to come back and try for such virtues, even in the face of human missteps. Like the professionals of the Weston State Hospital, and certainly those that came before me in the fields of psychology and behavior analysis, I came to do good. My work helps me to drives me to help people, and I do so with the full benefit of my predecessors and all of their successes, but even more so their failures. The things that they learned the hard way have informed my decisions today, and it's the same for all of you, okay? You need to watch me drink coffee for a minute. Yeah. All right, so we're going to do a little brief history of the world of psychology and psychiatry and how we all got here as behavior analysts. 1896, Leitner Whitmer opens the first psychological clinic in the United States focusing on the assessment and treatment of individuals with learning difficulties. 1898, Edward Thorndike developed the law of effect, arguing that a stimulus response chain is strengthened if the outcome of that chain is positive. Sound familiar? All right. Also in 1911, Thorndike published the first article on animal intelligence, leading to the theory of operant conditioning. 1908, Ivan Pavlov published the first studies on classical conditioning, laying the foundations for behaviorism. Take a look at that beard. You want to know why it's so soft and fluffy? Because he conditioned it. Ah. Oh, boy. Whew, dad jokes. Okay, 1913, John Watson published Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It, marking the beginnings of behavioral psychology. Also, in 1920, Watson and Rosalie Rainier published the Little Albert experiments, demonstrating that fear could be classically conditioned. How many of you remember reading about Little Albert? Yeah, he classically conditioned the kid to be scared of a white rabbit by putting the child on the floor, letting the white rabbit trot out in front of him, and when he came into view of the child, or the child saw it, crash, big noise, startle response, right? What happened? The kid ended up being scared of not just the rabbit, but anything else that was white and fluffy, including Santa Claus's beard, cotton balls, etc. Somebody asked me during one of these talks, I've done this several times for action behavior centers all over the US this year, and they're like, where is Little Albert? I was like, probably not doing good, right? If you look up what happened to Little Albert, FYI, I did this earlier, you can find some information. They think they may have identified him at some point later in the future, and they think that he possibly passed away in 2007. But I think it's a good nod to somebody that, again, we learned something because of what he went through, right? For better or for worse, we're here partly today because of Little Albert. So as an acknowledgement to him, go look him up. 1921, Herman Rorschach develops the Rorschach ink blot test, a projective psychological test used to assess personality traits and psychopathology. Anybody still using that assessment? Maybe TRICARE? 1932, the APA publishes the first edition of Ethical Standards of Psychologists, establishing ethical guidelines for the profession. 1932. 1936, we have our first lobotomy. 1932, ethics. 1936, lobotomies. Hold my beer. 1938, electroshock therapy was used on the first human patient. Also in 1938, B.F. Skinner publishes The Behavior of Organisms, outlining the principles of operant conditioning. And so here we all are. 1945, the state of Connecticut passed licensure for psychologists, becoming the first state to recognize psychology as a protected, practice-oriented profession. We're just now getting around to regulating this, right? That's a long time to go unregulated. That's a pretty good running start, right? All right, so the Lavender Scare was a 1950s period of fear and persecution of LGBTQ individuals in the US government. Senator Joseph McCarthy, that's the asshole on the left, and Roy Cohn, that's the asshole on the right, exploited this fear to advance their anti-communist agenda, targeting LGBTQ individuals through their baseless accusations and intimidation tactics. Their actions resulted in the dismissal of many government employees and had long-term effects on the LGBT, the alphabet mafia. I get tired of saying all those letters. Jeez, okay. All right, in 1952, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was published by the American Psychiatric Association, marking the beginning of modern mental illness classification. When the APBA, I'm sorry, whew, that was a major slip. Sorry, everybody. When the APA published the DSM-1 in 1952, homosexuality was classified as a, quote, sexual deviation within the larger sociopathic personality disturbance category of personality disorders. The sexual deviation diagnosis included homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism as examples. So we see how politics and mental health and diagnostics are all intertwined at that point in history, right? Also in 1952, thorazine was first used in treatment of schizophrenia. In 1952, British mathematician and codebreaker Alan Turing was arrested for homosexuality, which was illegal in the UK at the time. Turing was prosecuted and convicted of, quote, gross indecency. As a punishment, he was given the choice of imprisonment or chemical castration via hormonal treatment. Turing chose the latter, which had severe psychological and physical effects. And tragically, he died in 1954 by suicide. His arrest and mistreatment shed light on the injustice faced by the alphabet mafia under discriminatory laws and attitudes of the time. And Turing's legacy as a pioneer in computer science, along with his unjust treatment, contributed to the changes in public perception and eventual reforms regarding LGBTQ rights in the UK. That's the inventor of the modern computer. That's how we got Apple. That man was gay. He was incarcerated, arrested for homosexuality. Most of you are probably familiar with this picture and this individual. If you've celebrated Pride, yeah, go ahead, give it up. So the Stonewall riots of 1969 were a series of spontaneous disruptions by members of the LGBTQ community in response to a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York City. And at the height of the riots was Marsha P. Johnson, a transgender woman of color. Yeah. Johnson was a prominent figure in the LGBT rights movement and played a key role in the Stonewall uprising, alongside other transgender women, drag queens, lesbians, and gay men. Johnson resisted police harassment and sparked several days of protest, right? So this is our first Pride. The first Pride was a riot, right? It was an act of rebellion. It was an act of pushback. So you might be familiar with that picture, but how many of you are familiar with this picture? Okay. Introduced to the room as Dr. Henry Anonymous, wearing a wig and a tuxedo 3 sizes too big, and speaking through a microphone that distorted his voice, Dr. John Fryer stood in front of a crowd of psychiatrists at their annual meeting, donning a garish Richard Nixon mask that he and his lover had modified. It was 1972, and he masked himself in order to say the words, "I am a homosexual, and I am a psychiatrist." Right? And it was this conversation that started to change the DSM criteria related to homosexuality being classified as a mental illness. Right? The call came from inside the house, folks. So think about this. I'm telling you all this not because I'm trying to indoctrinate you or get you to come to my club, right? I'm telling you this because history has shown that attitudes about things like homosexuality evolve over time. And I think we're seeing the same thing happen with our understanding of autism and neurodiversity evolving over time, right? So again, the call needs to come from inside the house. We need to change the attitudes about treatment and support for individuals on the neurodiverse spectrum, okay? Thank you. Keep clapping. I'll keep drinking. All right. Other things. Oh, how do I go back? Come back. There we go. More fun. Cocaine. There they are. All right. You didn't need a doctor's prescription to purchase it. In some states, you could buy cocaine at a bar, and it was famously one of the key ingredients in Coca-Cola for a long time. There were an estimated 200,000 cocaine addicts in the U.S. alone by 1902, that is. And it took until 1914 for the Harrison Narcotic Act to outlaw the production and importation and distribution of cocaine. I wonder what was slowing them down. All right. Who remembers fen-phen? All right. So this was the new miracle drug that was brought into the market in 1992, and people could not get enough of it. Some doctors were looking for a quick way to make cash, and they started operating fen-phen clinics, basically, right? People could come in and basically ask for the drug themselves. The doctors would prescribe it. They're getting kickbacks for actually prescribing the drug. And the next thing you know, we've got hundreds of thousands of people that are now addicted to this speed, basically, right? This amphetamine. The problem was, of course, after a contentious debate in 1996, the FDA agreed to approve the drug pending a 1-year trial. Almost immediately, reports of grave side effects started pouring in, and that July, the Mayo Clinic said 24 women that were taking fen-phen had developed a serious heart valve abnormality. Hundreds of more cases were reported, and by September of 1997, the FDA had finally pulled the drug from manufacturing. In 1999, the Home Products Corporation, the producers of fen-phen, agreed to pay $3.75 billion to those who had been harmed. Does that sound familiar to another drug episode that we just went through? Right. Look at your data. The road to hell is paved with data you never looked at, right? So again, I say all this to tee up this conversation about what's going on with autism. For my entire career, people have said, what's going on with autism? Why is there such an increase in the rate of autism and the rate of diagnosis of autism? Why are we seeing this, right? Well, get ready. Hashtag it's not binary, right? There's a lot of different things going on in here. So I'm going to try to break this down for you a little bit. All right, all the way over there to the left, the first data point that's highlighted a little larger for you now, that says 1 in every 10,000 individuals. So when I first learned about autism in 1999 in my textbook in Kentucky at Center College, my textbook told me that autism was as prevalent as 1 in every 10,000 individuals, right? So this data is retrospective from the CDC, right? They didn't know at the time what the actual rate was. You have to go back and look how many different diagnostic claims did we get during that period. So 1 in every 10,000. Then we see there, 1980, we have the DSM-3. This is the first time in the Diagnostic Statistics Manual that autism is separated from childhood schizophrenia as a diagnosis. This is the first time it's a separate diagnosis. See where the stigma starts about giving a diagnosis of autism, right? Because the diagnosis is coming from pediatricians, or the referral to go get an evaluation is coming from the pediatricians. And if you went through this in the early 90s with me, you heard lots of stories from families that were told, oh, he's a boy. He's just going to develop later. Let's wait a while, right? Let's see what happens by his 4th birthday, his 5th birthday. And so crucial time was lost for kids that might have needed early intervention based on some stigma about what it meant to get an autism diagnosis back in that day, right? All right, so then we have, what year? 1994, 95, I think. I've cut my own stuff off here. Let's look. Yeah, about 94. So about 1994, we have 42% of Americans have a computer. Now, when I say computer, I mean something the size of this, right? And it had one cord that came out of it, and that was just for power, right? And it had a black screen and some green writing, and you had to have a disk, a floppy disk, to put into the thing, right? So that was a computer in 1994, or 1990, whatever that is. All right, then we get to 1994 is when the DSM-4 actually comes out. Now we have autism, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett syndrome, and Asperger's syndrome. 5 different diagnoses, right? All different criteria for diagnostics. Also in 1994, we see that Amazon.com opens in a garage, right? Jeff Bezos can kick rocks. Yeah, so also in 1995, 3% of Americans have used something called the World Wide Web. 1995, right? So now we're at 1 in every 1,000 individuals. Dawn of the internet, right? By the time we get to 1998, that's when the BACB is actually founded, right? So that's the beginning of our field. Well, not the industry, let's put it that way. The field started much longer ago. So we're 1 in every 500 individuals is now diagnosed with autism. And then we get up to 2000, and the DSM-4 revised comes out, and there's nothing spectacular about that. But what's interesting is that now in 2000, 78% of Americans have downloaded music. LimeWire, right? Remember your mom yelling at you to get off the computer so she could use the phone? Right? Some of you may remember that. So look what happened in the span of 5 years with that rate of adoption of a technology. We went from 3% of Americans were using something called the World Wide Web to now 80% of the society is now downloading music. That's a really rapid adoption of a technology, right? So now, when we look at the historical data, we went from 1 in 500 to 1 in 150 in that same 5 years, right? And so then, in 2001, we get the first state that's passed mandated insurance coverage for autism treatment. Which state is it? Indiana. Who knew, right? Oh, good job, Indiana. All right. So we're at 1 in 150. 2 years later, we're at 1 in 125. 2005, Autism Speaks starts. What does Autism Speaks do? They start a global campaign of awareness about autism, right? Like them or not, they got the word out, right? They came up with the puzzle piece. They came up with autism as, or April is Autism Month, right? World Autism Day. If you go look at the historical data for Google, what happens every April with the data? Searches for autism spike into the hundreds of percentages, right? So they got the word out. It worked, right? It worked. So now we're at 1 in every 110. Then we have 2007. We have 3 states that have coverage. I don't remember which 3 states. Doesn't matter. 1 in every 88. By the time we get to 2010, we now have 23 states that have mandated insurance coverage. And guess how many BCBAs there are worldwide? Less than 10,000. Think that's a problem? Cart before the horse? Maybe, right? You've got half of America is mandating insurance coverage insurance is covered for the treatment of autism, and we have less than 10,000 certified providers worldwide. That's crazy. So what's happening here? Is it more autism? Yes. But what's happening? The internet helped everybody find each other, right? The parents started talking to each other. Say, hey, that sounds like my kid. What are you doing? What kind of treatments are you doing? What kind of support? What is this thing called ABA therapy, right? What do you mean a board-certified behavior analyst? How do we get one of those? What do you mean you have insurance coverage? How do we get one of those here in our state, right? So it starts propagating. Hashtag it's not binary. It's a flywheel of information and demand over time, right? And so by the time we get to 2020, we've got diagnostic is 1 in every 44 individuals. We've got 40,000 BCBAs worldwide, right? Because people start saying, hey, we need more behavior analysts, right? So people are saying, that looks like a good job. I want to help people with autism, right? I want to get into that industry. Insurance companies start saying, uh-oh, we're going to have to find more providers because we're now mandated to actually pay for all this, right? So it's all driving each other. So here's the thing. There's been a large amount of discourse on the internet about ABA therapy and Autism Speaks and autism awareness versus acceptance. And I'm here to say it's not binary. You can do both. More than one thing can be true and valid at the same time. You don't have to pick. A lot of the criticism about applied behavior analysis in our history is justified, right? But a lot of that criticism comes from a group of people that are able to advocate for themselves, right? And it's not surprising that a group that's already identified with having difficulty with theory of other mind, that they might have a polarizing or self-centric view of these issues. And all I want to say is that just because you share a diagnosis or a group of traits with a group of people does not mean you get to speak for the whole group, okay? You get to advocate for yourself. That's what we all get to do. So hashtag it's not binary. You know, every year when autism awareness or support or autism month, whatever you want to call it, April comes around, I just simply say support people with autism in whatever way they choose, okay? It's sort of like pronouns, right? You ask people now all the time, what are your pronouns? What do you prefer? Well, some people prefer to say I am autistic. Some people prefer to say I'm a person with autism. Just support them whatever way they want to be supported, right? It is supposed to be a tenet of our science that we employ philosophic doubt. We must constantly be questioning or skeptical of treatments, experiments, etc. But again, I find this anxiety-driven need to pile on regarding certain movements is just as pernicious in our field as it is in society in general, right? While we all hold an opinion on almost everything, most of us have not done the work to actually be educated enough to have an opinion on those things, right? When we evaluate and compare a range of data points, whether that data is related to health outcomes, head counts, or menu prices, we tend to neglect the relative strength of the evidence and treat it as a simple binary. These binaries become ingrained in our operating systems of our brains, and they end up creating biases, right? So when you stop making a conscious choice between is it this or that, and you constantly make that same choice over and over again, now you're not in binary thinking anymore. You are operating in a bias. It is now on the hard drive of your brain, right? And it just lives there. And so that's why it's so important to be thoughtful about these things. So cognitive biases are often confused with logical fallacies. A cognitive bias refers to how our internal thinking patterns affect how we understand and process information. And a logical fallacy refers to an error in reasoning that weakens or invalidates an argument. So let's talk about some different types of biases. All right, confirmation bias. This is when your brain goes around an environment and starts collecting data points to already reinforce what you already believed, right? So if you believe that people that drive luxury cars are assholes, right? Every time one of them cuts in front of you, you're going to say, see? Assholes, right? That's confirmation bias. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the idea that things are simple because you only have a small amount of information about it, right? That you perceive something as being easy because you only know this much about the subject. One of my favorite pieces of information I found on the internet at one point, there was an organization in the UK, and they gave all of their employees a survey, and the data from the survey illustrated that over half of the men in the organization believed that they would be able to land a commercial airline if they needed to, right? Or that they would be able to return a serve from Venus Williams, right? It's like, that's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like, okay, buddy. In-group bias is the idea, again, that because somebody is expressing an opinion or some piece of data that is part of your group, that you are automatically going to agree with that, right? Versus somebody that may have an outside view from your group. So your in-group bias is tending to agree with the people that are already in your Venn diagram. Self-serving bias, it's a pretty easy one, right? That's sort of saying that when I work hard and I study and when I get an A on my exam, it's because I work hard and studied. Or if I got a bad grade on the exam, it's because the professor didn't do a good enough job, right? So that's self-serving bias. That's saying that when the good outcomes happen, it's because of me. And when bad outcomes happen, it's because of you, right? Availability bias is the idea that whatever most recent piece of information you got about a situation is going to cloud your decision-making related to the whole situation. So you just listened to a podcast about tech stocks, and so you assume you know plenty about investing in tech stocks all of a sudden, and you just go with it because you just listened to a podcast, right? Versus actually having a good understanding of technology, or the stock market, and all the things related to making those types of decisions, right? Fundamental attribution error, again, is the idea of when something is out of my control, I'm late to a meeting, it's because I know that I had to worry about my sick cat or dog on the way there, right? But when somebody else shows up late to the meeting, it's because they're lazy, right? Fundamental attribution error. Hindsight bias. Anybody think it was a good idea to wear a mask back in 2020 now? That's hindsight bias, right? Now you have all the information in the world that, I can see now that that would have been a good idea. At the time, I didn't have that data, right? Let's see, what's the next one? Anchoring bias. This is the notion that the first piece of information that you got about a decision point is going to anchor the data related to how you make that decision. So you go to a car lot, and the dealer says, okay, this is a $25,000 car, but I'll work with you on this, right? And then they eventually end up selling it to you for $20,000, even though it's not actually worth $15,000. Right? The anchoring bias is that you believe that this thing is worth $25,000 because that was the first thing that you heard about the situation, right? So that anchored your decision point and made you think that this was a more valuable deal than you actually got. Optimism bias. When we're in a good mood, we tend to think things are pretty good, right? And I think this is really important to consider given the population that we work with, right? When we write our session notes, when we write our treatment plans, when we write up our observations, if we're in a good mood, it's going to be reflected in those notes. Likewise, if we're in a bad mood, pessimism bias, we're going to feel very differently, and we're going to write very differently about our session notes, our treatment plans, our data, right? So you've got to be aware of these things. The halo effect is the idea that if you have one good point of data about a product or a company or something like that, then it tends to create a halo of the entire organization is also good that way. See this thing? This Apple Watch? This is the most expensive Find My Phone device I've ever gotten, right? It's not that great as a watch, right? But God bless anything Apple has, I'll run right out and buy it, right? That's halo effect. And status quo bias. I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with this as women, most of you, right? This is the notion of that's the way we've always done it, right? Why are we doing it that way? Because that's the way we've always done it. I have a friend of mine named Mark Eagles, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's at age 7, right? He's now in his 50s, but he has spent his entire life having to advocate for himself and talk to medical doctors who know more than he does about his condition, right? And so he constantly is having to educate them when they come at him with, well, that's how we've always done it, right? Well, we need to try something different. We need to challenge the status quo. Okay? So here's the thing. Even binary thinking is not binary. It's not all bad, right? Sometimes we need binary thinking. We need to make snap decisions about whether do I hit the brake or the gas pedal right now, right? Do I say yes or no to the person that just asked me out on a date, right? You have to make quick decisions in some circumstances. But I think we need to think about these things and take a great deal of self-awareness about whether or not we're operating in a binary, right? I think there's some simple tools and workarounds that we're going to be able to use, but it's going to take a little self-reflection. I think the biggest antidote here is to reclaim empathy, right? And again, I did this panel on shaming yesterday because I saw a lot of lack of empathy on some social media posts, right, regarding people in our field and constituents in our field. So I want you to imagine yourself as the target of unyielding criticism without an opportunity to explain your thinking or your context. I want you to try to put yourself in the shoes of your clients and their families and their schools and their workplaces and in the shoes of the RBTs and interns and supervisors and CEOs and in the shoes of the funders, because all of these entities have the well-being of the client done in the best, most cost-efficient, and least restrictive manner in their best interest. All three of them, all of them, right? It's supposed to be the case that it's in the best interest of the payer, the patient, and the provider to have the best possible outcomes for the shortest amount of time in treatment at the best rate. Hashtag it's not binary, right? Frequent phrase that I use is we'll see. How many of you guys have heard of the parable of the Zen master and the little boy? Right? So the story goes like this. 13-year-old boy gets a horse for his birthday. And the whole village says, how wonderful, right? And the Zen master says, we'll see. And then a couple of years later, the little boy falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And the whole village says, how terrible. And the Zen master says, we'll see. And then a few years later, a war breaks out. And all the young men have to go off to war, except for the little boy because he's got a permanent limp from where he broke his leg, right? So the concept here is that things are not inherently good or bad. Right? It's the context that makes it so, right? Wait a little bit longer, and the outcome may feel different to you, right? We'll see. You know, take your bad days and your good days with the same grain of salt. It's not always going to be this way, right? When I sold my clinic in 2019, I wasn't totally ready to sell my clinic. I didn't necessarily want to, but I tell you what, 6 months later when I didn't have to make payroll in a pandemic, I was feeling pretty good about it then, right? We'll see. All right. When people ask me, how are you? This is my standard answer. Good enough, right? It's a very skillful tact, right? It doesn't create a motivating operation for another man for information, right? People hate it when you say stuff like, oh, it's been pretty rough lately, right? Because then they're like, I didn't want, okay, yeah. So yeah, people say, how are you? I say, good enough. And people go, I like that. I'm going to start using that, right? It's very catchy. How many of you guys have heard of Hanlon's razor? Right? Never attribute to malice that which can be more adequately explained by incompetence. Please use Hanlon's razor on social media. They just don't know what they don't know. They're not being assholes. Most of the time. There's some assholes, right? It is okay to say, I don't know. I don't have enough information about that right now. I need to do some more research before I weigh in on this. I need more data. How strong is this data? Where did this data come from, right? It is okay to say, because there are thousands of wrong answers, and I don't know isn't one of them. So I came across this book by Bob Johansen in my research for this talk, and he talks about full spectrum thinking, right? And he talks about thinking about your best leaders. How did they treat you? How did they make you feel? How did they categorize you? And he says, my guess is that your best leaders didn't categorize others mindlessly. They made you feel recognized and empowered, but not stereotyped. They used appropriate categories to define your strengths and highlight your contributions, rather than pigeonhole you or degrade your efforts. They didn't box you into a category or categorize you as something that you are not. They saw the full amplitude of your potential. So he talks about full spectrum thinking. I like to say, be more mantis shrimp, right? Humans can process 3 channels of color, red, green, and blue, while the mantis shrimp perceives the world through 12 channels of color. They can detect UV and polarized light, aspects of light that humans can't even see with the naked eye. So I say not just full spectrum thinking, but mantis shrimp, super spectrum. FYI, if you have never heard of the comic theoatmeal.com, I highly recommend you go look it up and check out the whole spiel he's got about the mantis shrimp, because it's pretty funny. A little comedy. I want to leave you with a couple of different quotes here. The first one says, I learned very early in the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. All right? And the other quote is, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And I think about this in terms of verbal behavior, right? We say with our clients, we're teaching language skills. In order for something to be functional, they have to be able to use it across all the different operands, right? That's sort of what this is saying as well. So the big picture here is, do I know something about this procedure, or do I just didn't know the name of the procedure, right? Do I know something about this condition, this diagnosis, or do I just know the name of the condition or diagnosis? So you need to ask yourself, am I competent or am I confident? Okay? So back to that original question I started this all off with, why did you name the company Non-Binary Solutions? Well, there's 3 basic reasons. One, as we've been talking about, people are not binary in terms of being black or white. They're not just male and female. They're not this and that. In order to treat their humanity, you have to see the full amplitude of their potential, right? Secondly, because Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak got into an argument at one point, and Wozniak said to Jobs, you know, it's not binary. You can be both brilliant and decent at the same time. Because apparently he was a bit of a curmudgeon to work for. But the biggest reason is that now I get to stand up on stages like this and tell people, did you know that people on the spectrum are 6 times more likely to not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth? Right? Now I have created empathy. If you care about people with autism or neurodiversity, you now also have to care about gender fluid, non-binary, trans people, right? Right? Yeah. Yeah, with all of this hateful legislation going around, it's an opportunity to educate people and to create empathy and to try to get these discussions back into the public. So thank you guys very, very much for your kind attention. Yeah, feel free to follow me on social media. Those of you that you do know that I tend to say that I am vaguely professional on LinkedIn. I am mostly authentic on Instagram, and I am completely unhinged on Facebook. All right? So buyer beware. Thank you guys very much.